I'm going to talk briefly about some of the implications of what you might consider the polygenic revolution. So, what I mean by the polygenic revolution is the use of genomic data to create polygenic risk scores, which can then be used by adults to predict your disease profile, whether you're likely to, let's say, develop Alzheimer's disease later on, that sort of thing. And more specifically, as my company does for embryos. So I'm going to be one of the few, maybe the only person talking about longevity, not for you, you guys are cooked, but for your kids, your grandkids. How, if you're going through IVF, would you select an embryo given its genetic profile and given that you're going to have some ability to select? You're going to have more embryos than you need in order to implant. How would you do that? And I'm going to talk about how polygenic scores can help with that. Um, as mentioned, yeah, I started out as a professor of PPE. That's an old Oxford program, philosophy, politics, economics. It's sort of the intersection of political philosophy and game theory, the foundations of economics and politics. I wrote a little book. I'm not shilling the book per se, but this is how I got involved in a company that is now using polygenic scores to guide embryo selection. So I was interested as an academic in what would happen when each parent had the power to either select or eventually edit the genetic endowment of their kids. What traits would they select? And would those traits in a way harmonize socially? So if each of us is choosing for our own ends, is that likely to result in a collective benefit or cost? So that's the kind of origin story. And then I was contacted some years ago by some people working on polygenic scores, kind of at the cutting edge, not just for disease traits, but for mental traits as well. So if we are thinking about which embryo to implant, so let me back up. Suppose you're doing IVF, in vitro fertilization. If you do it young, you can get a lot of eggs, and from those eggs, you'll get a lot of embryos. In the future, maybe even if you're old, you'll do the same if in vitro gametogenesis works out. I won't get into the details there, but the more embryos you have to choose from, the more genetic diversity you have, right? The more likely it is that you can reduce your overall risk of various diseases or increase whatever traits that you like. It could be height or intelligence or whatever you're interested in. So one of the things that we're doing, I'm going to ignore aesthetic traits, personality traits, cognitive ability. Our company does do some of those, and we can talk later if you're interested. But I'm just going to focus on disease traits. So imagine you only had 3 embryos. Many people have more than this, but say you only had 3. Which one would you choose to implant just on the basis of their disease profile? Well, the first thing to note is that individual genetic variants that cause disease, that cause serious disease, are quite rare. So we've heard of some of them, and we name them precisely because they're rare. Tay-Sachs, hemochromatosis, Huntington's disease. These are cases where a single gene, if both parents have a copy, leave a kid in really bad shape, take a lot of years off of life, maybe even in the case of Tay-Sachs, lead to stillbirths and so on. We've heard of a few others, like the BRCA genes for breast cancer. They don't guarantee that you'll get breast cancer or ovarian cancer, but they substantially raise the risk. But we focus on these, or the media does, precisely because they're so rare. They're really unusual. That's not how genetics works for the most part. Instead, the way that it works is that each gene contributes a little bit, or each genetic variant, as it's called, each polymorphism contributes just a little bit to an overall risk that you'll get, let's say, breast cancer, schizophrenia, any of these traits that you care about. So if you go back 15, 20 years, we used to see these headlines all the time. Scientists have found the gene for diabetes. Scientists have found the gene for intelligence, that would be shocking if there was a gene for intelligence, right? One gene made us different from rats, which made us different from ants, et cetera. I mean, nobody should have ever believed this story anyway. That's too implausible, right? Instead, it turns out thousands and thousands of genes contribute overall to cognitive ability, to schizophrenia, to the probability that you'll develop breast cancer or diabetes. So, as mentioned, only a few rare monogenic conditions are like that. Now, how do we know this? It's worth just pausing before I go through our kind of way of aggregating disease predictors into an overall longevity index. How do we predict this? Well, it turns out, over the last 20, 25 years since the human genome was sequenced, the cost of sequencing continues to drop, the accuracy continues to rise. And as that happens, governments, especially you can think of the UK Biobank, the US has a bunch of these biobanks as well, they take great interest in polygenic prediction because it can help them with their overall, think of in the UK, you've got socialized medicine. So how do you reduce costs? How do you increase lifespan, et cetera? So if you can gather a bunch of data, sequence millions or hundreds of thousands of your own people, and then match up those genetic sequences with the disease profile that you know they have. Let's say this person has developed diabetes or breast cancer or has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Across hundreds of thousands of people, if you can do that, you can start scanning the genome and figuring out which of those genetic variants are associated with which of those traits. The easiest one is just height, right? Because it's so easy to measure. It's very difficult to misdiagnose height. I guess it can be done. But that's kind of how this works. So as the cost of sequencing has fallen and the accuracy has risen, governments have created these biobanks, sequence hundreds of thousands, millions of people, match up those sequences with particular life outcomes or traits. And from that, you can develop polygenic risk scores. That is, you can develop a probability for any one person, given their genetic profile, that they're going to be a certain height, develop diabetes, et cetera. Now, when we think about embryos, the way this is going to work is, of course, each embryo has a unique genetic profile, unless it's a twin. And so what we're going to get are relative differences like the following. Embryo 1, let's say, has a 1.7% risk of developing schizophrenia. There's going to be some margin of error, of course. Embryo 2, 1.2%. Embryo 3, 2.8%. That's just an example. This isn't anyone's actual embryos. Now, these scores are going to be affected, the magnitude, by family history. So one thing people will want to do is if you have schizophrenia in your family or diabetes in your family, you'll probably want to focus on those particular traits, and these outcomes will look very different. So let's take, this is an example of breast cancer. Let's say it runs in the family. Embryo 1's got a 5% lifetime risk, embryo 2, 13%, embryo 3, 15%. Now, my question is not so much about polygenic scores per se, but what are we going to do when the thousands and thousands of known genetic diseases can be given polygenic risk scores? So let's go into the future. I mean, we already do this now. We can predict 30 or 40 diseases with a great deal of accuracy. But imagine that number's 100, 1,000, 3,000. How are you going to select embryos? How are you going to sort of navigate those crazy trade-offs? And this is just a visual example where, embryo 5 here is at low risk of melanoma, medium risk of psoriasis, et cetera. You can just go down the list. So one thing you'll probably do, what couples will likely do, is think, well, what diseases are likely to be cured in the next 50 years? What diseases could be avoided with the right kind of diet? And a lot of people here are going to be talking about diet and medication and so on. Diabetes is a pretty good example, especially type 2. It's really not that big of a deal if you keep a really good diet. That is, having a high risk of it, compared to a high risk of schizophrenia, which there's really nothing we can do about now, and maybe there never will be, who knows? So one way to do it is think about the magnitude of the risk, think about what's likely to be curable, what runs in the family. But even when you've gone through all of that, how are you going to trade these things off? And one thing that we can do, and we just do what economists already do, which is develop a metric like quality-adjusted life years, or in this case, disability-adjusted life years, and just figure out for each disease, what is the likely number of years and quality of years that it reduces in an embryo. And by summing these all up, you're basically predicting longevity, quality and quantity of life. Some people might think, oh, probably not people here, but, oh, this is just, I don't know, you're putting a value on life, or, you're sort of mathematizing, some kind of moral trade-off. Yeah, that's true in a way. We're allowing parents to use information about the genetic profile of their kids in order to make those judgments. We do it with houses and cars. We do it when we're going through medical regimes. We're deciding, how much more medicine to take, what kinds of medicine to take, what are the probabilities that it's going to work, et cetera. And in a sense, companies, governments, I hope, aren't going to do this for people, but instead provide people with as clear of information as possible so that they can do it. And so that genetic counselors and so on can help them navigate that information. So one thing we could do then, and I'm going to skip to this and this, is we can develop an overall polygenic longevity index where we use disability adjusted life years, and you rank the embryos by, again, quality and quantity of life, where each particular disorder to which they're subject, to which there's some probability that they'll develop, can be ranked. And in many cases, it'll be worth discarding, not discarding the embryo, but not worrying about the particular thing. Osteoporosis is taking off 0.01 life years, to use this example. But schizophrenia, 4 years relative to the next best embryo, et cetera. So in other words, one thing that you can do with a really, really complicated choice, I'll go back to the beginning, where you've got not just 3 embryos, but let's say a dozen embryos and 100 diseases that you could potentially predict, all of which have some uncertainty, is you can focus on the ones that you care about most, that you think are less likely to be cured, have a really adverse impact on the person's life if it's implanted, the ones that run in your family. And then you can use this kind of polygenic longevity index to look specifically at which diseases are likely to take off a certain amount of life or a certain quality of life. And I think this is really interesting because I learn from this all the time when we're doing this with the company. So for example, I didn't realize this, but psoriasis takes off quite a few life years, quality adjusted life years. We think of it as just like a skin rash or a skin disorder, but it's actually an autoimmune disorder. And so probably what's going on here is, your immune system is busy attacking your own cells rather than fighting off viruses and bacteria. So you've got low levels of inflammation your whole life, or you get more infections than you otherwise would your whole life. And so what we can do in essence here is we can kind of educate individual users of IVF on, how to sort of quantify what's likely to happen if they implant one embryo rather than another. So that's what we're doing, and that's how we think we can maximize longevity for the next generation. Thank you.